Our reading today is by David Croft. When I was a kid, I liked to skip stones on lakes. If I threw a flat stone at the correct angle and with enough speed and energy, it would kiss the surface and leap into the air again and again. Similarly, if we have too much stuff in our lives, our attention skips from one object to another without really enjoying anything. If we have too many activities, our attention jumps from past to future without settling into the present. If we have too many opinions, we end up thinking about how things should be without fully seeing how things are. But my friends, happiness and ease flow from the bottom of the lake. They aren't found hopping over the surface of life. You have to slow down to settle into the depths. And so, as we transition to the message, I just invite you to take a moment to settle. I know we are all processing the sad news we heard about Cynthia. And I want to honor your sorrow as we settle into this time and place in which we are together. And now for today's sermon. According to the Dalai Lama, the purpose of our lives is not to be successful or productive or even to make the world a better place. It is to be happy. He writes, I believe that the very purpose of our life is to seek happiness. That is clear. Whether one believes in religion or not, we all are seeking something better in life. So I think the very motion of our lives is towards happiness. Now, the founders of our nation must have concurred, because when they gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 to draft the official statement of principles upon which the new republic was to be built, they decided that happiness was so important that they wrote it right into the preamble. You probably know this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, they wrote, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. From the very beginning, then, as a people, we have been passionately devoted to pursuing happiness. One would think, then, that the United States would be among the happiest countries in the world. Yet we all probably know this is not proven to be the case. According to the United Nations' latest World Happiness Report, the U.S. currently ranks only 16th in happiness levels. Now, economist Jeffrey Sachs, one of the authors of that UN report, blames some social factors for this decline in happiness here. Specifically, fewer people feel that they have control over the choices in their lives. Fewer feel that they have others to count on in times of difficulty. Fewer people trust politicians and other public figures these days, and fewer people are being generous towards others. Now, while I agree with Sachs that we are indeed experiencing a social crisis, I think we're also experiencing a spiritual crisis. And since the Dalai Lama is of the mind that we are here to be happy, perhaps we might benefit from some reflection to these common obstacles to happiness. So today I'd like to examine happiness through a Buddhist lens specifically. I want to talk about the 3 poisons and their antidotes. Now, the 3 poisons are the mental attributes that keep us trapped in what the Buddhists call samsara, which is the cycle of meaningless, painful existence. And more of us are experiencing the hellscape of samsara. As we know, homelessness continues to grow. The climate is changing faster than predicted. Changes in technology, such as artificial intelligence, email scams, malware, and virtual realities, leave us wondering, what is real and whom can we trust? And any conversation eventually leads to our worry and in some our terror about what the future holds. So with all of these stressors, plus the others I didn't list, is it any wonder why our levels of happiness are so low? So I think today is a good day to step back and examine our current state of being from a Buddhist perspective. Now, if the Buddha himself were standing here instead of me, I think he might make the following diagnosis: that we, as a society, are unhappy because we have failed to keep the 3 poisons in check. What are the 3 poisons? Greed, hate, and delusion. And they've been around for as long as there have been humans. The 3 poisons are understood as negative qualities of the mind or conscience, and the Buddha initially referred to them as the 3 fires, and that's because fire is a very important and common metaphor in Buddhism, and putting out such fires is the goal of Buddhist practice. In fact, the word nirvana is derived from the extinguishing of fires. But over time, this transition from the term fires to poisons came, especially within the Mahayana and Tibetan Buddhist traditions. I think you know that the Dalai Lama is Tibetan Buddhist, as is Thich Nhat Hanh, whom I will discuss in just a minute. But before I do so, I want to remind you, because this is so central to Buddhist thought, that the Buddhist primary teachings are really about 2 things: the existence of suffering, which I know we all feel today, and the means by which to end suffering. The Buddha taught that suffering is the most universal of human experiences. And yet, for a variety of reasons, we humans often deny our own suffering. It's as if we're ashamed of our suffering. And so we expend a lot of energy trying to ignore it and hide it from others. I'm fine, we say. But here's the thing. If we don't deal with our suffering, what happens? Our suffering increases. And if not kept in some sort of check, this unaddressed suffering can spiral us into feelings of despair, depression, and desperation, all of which, by the way, are epidemic in this country. So, one of the gifts of Buddhism brings us the honest acknowledgement that suffering is just a part of life. We can't control that fact, but we can transform suffering when it lands in our lap. And I think Tibetan Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh provides us with some examples of that. Now, many of you know that Thich Nhat Hanh was exiled from his homeland in Vietnam. This was in 1966 when war was raging in his country. And if you've read his book, The Miracle of Mindfulness, then perhaps you'll recall that it was written as a manual for monks and nuns seeking to be healing forces for people caught up on every side of violence. Now, allow me to tell you about the place where Thich Nhat Hanh ended up residing and creating a community and retreat center. It's called the Plum Village, and here is the origin story. The land where Thich Nhat Hanh went after being exiled was in a village in the French countryside. During World War II, that very plot of land was a site of bitter controversy and bloody reckoning. It is where members of the local community executed those who had participated in the Nazi occupation. By the time Thich Nhat Hanh arrived, the ground had been considered haunted for decades and was seen as unfit for habitation. But Thich Nhat Hanh, upon visiting the site and hearing this story, decided this was precisely where his community should settle. This is because he believes that attending to the ruptures of this world is the spiritual work we are all here to do. Now, that sounds very idealistic, and it's hard to imagine. So I want to share with you an exercise he shared with his folks and people continue to do today. And it involves participation. So those of you who are sleeping, it's a good time to wake up. So I'm going to ask that you take your hand and turn it into a fist. Now, keeping that fist, use the other hand to try to unclench the other hand, the fist. Well, the other hand clenches tighter when we do that, right? It's as if it, on its own will, or even like a natural reaction to force, is to clench tighter. And now I want to invite you to a counterintuitive approach, which is what Thich Nhat Hanh is all about, counterintuitive approach. So have that clenched fist, but now cradle the fist with your other hand. With the same naturalness, but a wholly other quality of feeling and response, the fist starts to release. It softens when it's cradled. Now, this is a powerful metaphor for our country right now, because we are a sea of clenched fists. And one of the most effective ways we can soften the sea of fists is to be present to our country's pain with a countercultural tenderness. For as we are present to the pain, we can unleash the promise. And we find our way back to each other. Now, by taking stock of how the three poisons are materializing in our own lives, helps us along the way. What are those three poisons again? Greed, hatred, delusion. Very good, you're awake. Now, greed has historically been viewed as one of the 7 deadly sins of Christianity, which is the primary religion in this country. And somewhere along the way, I would blame Reagan. Greed has slowly become acceptable to us. We, as a society, are allowing profiteering in all segments of society, even in the military, even in our schools, even in our health care. This collective acceptance of greed helps explain why we exalt those who have obtained extreme levels of wealth. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerman, Bill Gates, Elon Musk. We somehow tell ourselves that they're so rich because they're doing something right. They're just so smart. And since they're so rich, we assume that they are so happy, right? Yet research reveals that after reaching a certain household income, like between $120,000 and $150,000, the richer we get, the less happy we actually become. How could this be? Well, as some of you may know, it's not just the adults who are impacted by this phenomenon. Children who come from extremely affluent families are more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Far higher rates than those who come from less affluent families. Apparently, once we have enough money to meet our basic needs, extra money simply fuels our desire to pursue more material gains and more social comparisons. And both of these tend to erode our own self-being, the worth of it, and it erodes community. Now, psychologist Elizabeth Lombardo calls this quest for more and more the treadmill effect, and it drives workaholism and perfectionism, both of which destroy happiness by causing major health and relationship stresses. You see, greed is considered poisonous because it actually removes us from the things in life that actually do make us happy, such as being in loving relationships, being generous, having leisure time, and helping others. Greed strips us of the time for these things. And the antidote to greed is generosity. Give it away. Help others. Now, I just spent quite a bit of time on greed because I personally think it's our country's greatest problem. But the second problem is hatred. It is sometimes translated as rage. And as you know, both hatred and rage are rampant now in this country. Road rage, death threats and violence against elected officials and their families, mass shootings, terrorism, genocides. And if we're honest with ourselves, we may at times experience hatred and rage within ourselves. I know I do. Especially when we're feeling powerless or watching too much news, or when we can't stop the self-destructive behavior of someone we love, or when we see someone harming innocents. Now, it's important to note that the Buddha, of all of the emotions, the Buddha considers hate and rage to be the most destructive. And yet, the difficult truth of this matter is that none of us is immune from this poison. We all experience it somewhere in our lives. And these emotions can make us do and say things that we later regret. But the Buddha teaches us that Each of us has the ability to transform the energy that hatred and rage fuels into something that's actually productive. So it's the promise. We have this horrible thing that we feel, but the promise is that we can use that energy to transform the situation that's angering us. So the Me Too movement is an example, and what we all are experiencing since Roe versus Wade was overturned. These are enraged men and women, largely women, who are saying, this is enough. We're not going there. And it's just like the Voting Rights Act, which emerged from our fiery response to the murder of Emmett Till and the treatment of freedom riders. Similarly, Gandhi's nonviolent revolution was in response to the British oppression and colonization of India. And the key to these examples provide us with the knowledge that it's not healthy to stew in our rage and hatred. We must be mindful to it, redirect it, and use the energy generated by it to transform the situation at hand into something positive and productive, something grounded in love and compassion. This is not easy spiritual work, by the way, but it is possible. So, I've addressed greed and hate. Let's take a quick look at the third poison, delusion, which is sometimes translated as ignorance. All I have to do is mention alternative facts, QAnon, MAGA, or Fox News to illustrate why ignorance and delusion can be toxic. This third poison is grounded in denial and ideology and emotional manipulation by people with agendas. And it has the potential to do great harm, as we've all been witnessing. This is the best one because the antidote to this poison is the cultivation of wisdom, which you all do really well here. So how do we cultivate wisdom? By being curious, by not accepting easy answers, and by, this is the hard part, be willing to grow and be changed by others' perspectives. And this all requires the spiritual quality of mindfulness. We have to be self-aware enough to correct course when we've been deluded. Again, this is not easy spiritual work, but it's essential spiritual work. So, in summary, the three poisons are greed, rage, and delusion. And the antidote to greed is generosity, which you demonstrate every time you share your time, talent, treasure, and presence with others. The antidote to rage and hatred is love and compassion, which is practiced here every time I meet with you. I see it in the joys and sorrows, and I see it when you offer meals and comfort to others when life brings them injury, illness, loss, or heartbreak. And lastly, the antidote to delusion is the cultivation of wisdom, which is something that you place so much emphasis on that we wrote it into our fourth principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So, as I hope I've illustrated, the three poisons are part of the human condition, but their antidotes are too. They have always been available to us. And the reasons why communities like UUCWI are so important is because this is where we mindfully nurture these antidotes right here within us and within this community. And being a part of this community, my friends, brings us so much happiness, which, remember, according to the Dalai Lama, is the very purpose of our lives. So in closing, David Croft reminded us in our reading this morning that happiness isn't found hopping over the surface of life. It is found at the bottom of the lake. So what we all need to do is slow down enough to settle into the depths to find it. May this be a community that is unafraid to settle into the depths today and forevermore.